And today, my guest is Paul Greci, who is an educator and an author. And the story that is Paul and I met casually almost 20 years ago, I would say now, at an Allen workshop. And we kept tangentially running into each other, because one's from, I was at the time working at LSU, he's in Alaska, and we would kind of run into each other and check in on what was going on with our various careers. And along the way, lo and behold, Paul becomes an author. And so tell us a little bit about that, Paul. How did you make your way to Alaska in the first place? Because you're not a native Alaskan.
Yeah. So, well, when I was a sophomore in college, I had the opportunity to come up here and work in a salmon cannery.
Yeah.
Um, and I had started, I was interested in like spending time in outdoor kind of wild places, and my friend Lee, he was given the use of his grandfather's Caprice Classic four-door car, and we drove that thing 5,000 miles up to Alaska and got jobs in the salmon cannery and worked 15 hours a day, 6 days a week cleaning fish. My
Yeah.
first summer in Alaska, and so that was really my introduction to Alaska. And I came back the next summer and did that again. And then when I graduated from college, I got a volunteer job on a wildlife refuge on the Bering Sea coast,
Oh,
and worked out there for 6 months doing marine mammal and bird surveys, and yeah, just I was very interested at that time of my life and just spending lots of time in wild places, and so that's kind of how I got there. And then fast forward 3 or 4 more years, I was in Alaska doing some field biology, and I was also at the same time I was spending my school years working as a naturalist in some outdoor ed programs in California and Pennsylvania, and I really liked working with kids. I was getting tired of moving around, and so I decided that I was gonna stay in Alaska and get my teaching credential in 1990, and so that's kind of when I made the permanent move to Alaska.
and in those days, did you have to go back and get a master's degree at the University of Fairbanks or something like that? Or how did you achieve the credential?
And so what I did, I had a BA in English and psychology, and I so I started taking classes to get my elementary, at the time was gonna be my elementary teaching credential, but at the same time, I was also, I was, gosh, how old was I? 26, 27. I was also interested in working, both because it was interesting and because I needed to make a living too. Alaska is not an inexpensive place to live, even if you live simply. And so I ended up just kind of looking through the paper. I saw there was a job at this alternative school as a teacher aide, and I'm like, well, I've never really been in a classroom setting. I've only done outdoor ed. I may as well apply for this job. So I applied for the job, and I got the job, and I continued to work on my teaching credential while I was working at this school for kids who had exhausted all their public school options. It was a school
Yeah.
of 21 kids, and uh, and eventually, over the course of a few years, I got that credential, and then I became a teacher in that school for kind of at-risk teens. It was a real inspiration for my writing too. And if I could
Yeah.
just talk about this for a minute, just
Sure.
about because my writing is really tied to that school. And so when I first got the teaching job at the school with my credential, I was teaching science and social studies, and I was just doing all these hands-on activities to get get these kids involved, because if you had these guys interested in something, you had a lot less behavior problems.
Sure.
So I did that for 4 years, and I kind of got burned out on the prep for that, because I
Yes.
would spend hours and hours, getting things ready. And then the English teaching job opened up there, and at the same time, I got a promotion to be the lead teacher at that school. Majored in English in college and I developed a love of reading over time in my life. Now, as a kid, I was not a voluntary reader. I was a kid who played outside a lot, did my reading for school, but I wasn't someone who was just like drawn to books until I got to high school, and I had an English teacher who could really make a story come alive. And that's what kind of led me to major in English in college. Was my high school English teacher lit a flame there. When I took that lead teacher job in 1998, I was looking for books that would engage reluctant readers. And that is when I discovered young adult fiction. And so I would go to the library and I would get stacks of books and I would read them. Great novels. I loved reading them. And I would, read, 10 or 15 books, and I would, usually find one that my reluctant readers would connect to. Not because those books were bad, they were great, but you just needed, something a little more on the edge for the reluctant readers. And so I was doing that for a few years, and then I had I felt like if I had a good book in my hand, if I was reading them a novel, I had them, and we could have great discussions and really talk about the story. And then at that point, Steve, I felt like, well, I'm doing about half my job, because I got them reading, got them talking about reading, but we're really not doing any writing, and so I developed these assignments where I would stop at a high point in a story, and I would tell my kids, okay, you're the author, you write the next, couple paragraphs of the story. And so students, I found out if they had a developed plot and a character, they were pretty happy to take over, and so as a teacher, mostly what I had done over the years is whatever I asked my kids to do, I also did. And so as I was writing like the continuation of, books like Hatchet and The Green Book and The Trouble with Lemons, I discovered, wow, I really like writing stories. And so I really credit my students at that school with, discovering that I liked writing fiction. I'd always kept journals and I wrote poetry in college, but in terms of writing stories, it really was my students. And so then I had an idea for my own story. This was about in the year, I think it was 2000, 2002. And I was a big sea kayaker and had this father-son survival story in my head. And so I guess it was 2000. And so I was a person who rode my bike to work, even in the winter here. And so I would ride my bike and I would like work on this story in my head. And I didn't start writing it down. And I told myself at the time, I said, well, Paul, you're doing all these other things. You can write that later, so a couple of years go by and I'm like working on the story, but I haven't written anything down. And then it was the end of the school day, and I was walking this kid out to the buses, and he was 16, 17 years old. He had fetal alcohol effect. And so he had a lot of challenges, but was not a violent kid at all. And just like out of the blue, he just gave me this roundhouse punch to the face. And I was bruised. I wasn't, badly injured. He was like hovering in a corner. He didn't know why he had done that, and I continued to work with him, for the next couple of years. But it sort of made me realize, your life could be over tomorrow. And so the very next day, I started writing down my story. And I wrote the first 35 pages on notebook paper. And eventually, 13 years later, it became, was published as Surviving Bear Island. So anyway, the kids were they were my inspiration for for writing.
Well, I worked in high schools for 25 years, and I taught some rough kids from time to time in some of in schools I was in, but I never taught in one of those special programs. And then I've come to know enough teachers who, like you, who worked at these last resort schools. It's a remarkable benefit for kids to be able to go to those schools and survive them. I remember talking to a kid, a guy who taught in New York City in a last ditch school, and it was him and another teacher and 12 kids,
Mhm.
and they met in an old townhome, and he said we were in charge of every subject and their food. He said they gave us
Yeah,
a budget, and he said the kids had to come in, and what part of the curriculum was they did breakfast and lunch, and they had part of their curriculum was planning menus and
right.
buying it, and
Yeah.
and and uh, that guy really reshaped. I met him at a NEH seminar one summer, and he shaped how I did journal assignments after that,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
he was saying anybody can write, they just don't want to write, right? So
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah, yeah.
and he's and so what he said, well, what are you required? He says, well, they have to write a page a day, and it can be about anything, and it doesn't have to be perfect, and I never correct it.
Hmm.
He says, but then I draw on it for other assignments. Go
Hmm.
back on that, right? Find something that you wrote in the journal for me, and he would give them a notebook, 100 page notebook, and say, this is, in 45 days, I got to see 45 page of writing, and do that. And I said, well, do they all do it? He says, of course they don't all do it, but,
Right, right.
but some are doing it and more are doing it. And then if you use it as a tool, and I adopted that, and, for long, long time use some version of that to help me write and kids write as well, to do that. But I love that story that where, you get like the bolt of enlightenment, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Maybe maybe you
yeah,
got to start
yeah,
doing that. Well, tell us a little bit about then. Surviving Bear Island is the first book then that you
yeah,
got published.
yeah.
Okay,
Hmm.
so tell us a little bit about where it comes from, how long you played with it before you got
Yeah.
it published,
Sure.
because it was a long journey, right?
It was a long journey, yes. Yeah. And so yeah, I started writing it, I think in 2002. And that might have been the year I met you, maybe in San Francisco, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
something like, yeah, that
yeah,
might be exactly right. It was
that was
early
my first
on.
that was my first Allen conference. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that one. So I was working on this, and so I had done a lot of sea kayaking in Prince William Sound, and I kept very extensive journals on things, and I was kind of fascinated by survival, and so it seemed natural to me to sort of write a survival story. It's kind of write what you know,
Yeah.
kind of experience, but the journey to getting it published was very, very twisted journey. And so I wrote a draft of the book. Took a couple years to do that, and by the time I got done with it, I had an idea for another story, and um, and I and I started writing that story. It's called Siblings, and it was kind of inspired by my oldest brother who had passed away from AIDS in 1991,
Uh,
at young age, at 33 years old, and so I was really captivated by that story that I was writing. Um, and uh, and so I took um, a 15-page excerpt of that to a conference, and maybe you've heard of that conference in Utah, writing and illustrating for students. It's out of Brigham Young.
oh
Um,
yeah, I
Carol,
know of it.
Carol,
Yeah.
Carol Lynch Williams used to run it.
Yeah.
And so I took my part of that book down there, and it got some attention from the agent who was there, and
Oh, good.
Stephen Frazier, who's a very nice person, very encouraging. And at this point, Steve, I'd been working in that alternative school for about 15 years, and I was kind of ready for a little break from that. And so I came back from this conference all fired up, and my wife and I have always supported each other in our creative endeavors. And so I was like, oh, I'd really like to set teaching aside for a while and write full time. And she's like, go for it, do that. And so I did that. I resigned from my job in 2007, and so that my book Siblings got attention, but it didn't get an offer of any kind of representation or anything. And then I had this other idea to write a story based on my time in the alternative school. And so I wrote, and I was writing, I treated writing, especially, I recognized the gift my wife had given me of writing at home. And so I really treated it like a job.
Yeah.
I was, working probably longer hours writing than I was teaching. And I wrote this book called The Search for Normal. And that book got a lot of attention. It got me, after a couple of years of writing that, it got me like 5 offers of representation from agents. And so,
Wow.
and so I picked an agent, and she was sure she was going to be able to sell that book, and she put it out there, and she got some good, some good feedback. It got kind of moved up in the process at a couple places, major publishers, but then it would always, nothing ever really worked out. And I told her, well, I've got this other manuscript, which,
Yeah.
is Surviving Bear Island. And so I sent it to her, and I could never really tell where she was submitting it. She could never really tell me that. And at the time, Steve, I mean, I was just full on a writing machine. I was reading books on writing. My learning curve was going up. And so I was busy working on this manuscript as she was trying to sell this.
Sell this one. Yeah.
Or at least she said she was trying to sell it. And I sent her this, and she wouldn't even read it. And this manuscript had taken second place in the Pacific Northwest Writers Conference, thing. And so I did the hard thing for an unpublished writer to do, but I parted ways with my agent. And, because it's hard to find an agent, especially if you have anything published and you don't have connections. And so about this time, I was going back to work as a teacher. It's 2011 now, and I'm back teaching at a different job. But and I looked for another agent, and I'm querying this book now, because this is a new book that no one has ever seen. And I get, after several months, I get a couple offers of representation, and Amy Tipton is the person who I signed with, and she starts putting this book out there in the world, and she's getting lots of great responses. Oh, great story. But, the market's kind of flooded with these kind of post-apocalyptic books. There's no way I could get an acquisitions committee to take this. And so Amy tells me, she's like, well, Paul, we're going to have to sit on this for about 5 years, And so do you have anything else? And so I'm like, yes, I have this. And so Amy and I worked on this for about 8 months together, going back and forth on revisions. And then, so she eventually found a publisher for this book. And so, like, for me, I thought for sure my book Siblings would be my first published book. Then I thought it would be The Search for Normal. Then I thought it would be this. And what does it turn out to be but the first book I ever wrote, working on for 15 years.
Yeah.
And
It's a long journey.
Yeah.
And that's the first book of yours I read, because when it came out, I knew you, and I thought, oh, and I liked it, and I thought it fit really well in the genre of all those books. Gary Paulson, bless his heart, isn't going to live forever, and people need to write those stories, because there's still stories out there. Ben Michelson is writing them, but again, these people run their cycle. So I'm glad you stuck with it. So then after that one, you I really liked the Wildlands too when it came. So tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about you're writing that because you're telling me then that kind of came about um, as you're trying to establish yourself as a writer, but at the end of this or in the middle of this big learning curve, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
what are some
so,
of the inspirations of that besides
yeah.
adventure, Alaska, survival, all of
Yeah.
that is in there.
So with surviving Bear Island, I was kind of writing what I knew, in terms of, being out in a wilderness setting and making a lot of mistakes and having to kind of deal with them. And then with the Wildlands, I was really writing what I wanted to know, like what is this place going to look like in 100 years with the way the climate is changing,
Mm.
like what's gonna happen there. And it was and so that was kind of the inspiration for this book, because I'm fascinated by the way that the world is changing. And so this
Yeah.
was my attempt to kind of make sense of that a little bit. And and so yeah, and this book, I mean, this book obviously took, 13 years, about 50 revisions, because I really was learning how to write. And as I wrote these other books, I kept coming back to this and revising it. And this book, and every book is different, but this book, it took me about 10 months to get this book into shape where an agent wanted to represent it. But the inspiration for it was really writing, like, what did I want to know about the future?
So after the Wildlands, which comes next?
So what happened was, let's see. So these other two books, they almost happened at the same time. Because what happened was, Amy was able to get me a book contract for this book, and and then, once this book came out, I had an idea for a follow-up book to this book, and
Yeah.
and as I was thinking about that, Amy got me this book deal, but this was a 2-book deal where, I had another book I had to write in a year. And so, what happened was I, I was working on this book, Follow the River, because this book, when I first wrote it, was not under contract. My publisher was, really like Surviving Bear Island. It was a very successful
Yeah.
book. It was Junior Library Guild, Scholastic Reading Club. It was the Alaska Reads book, pick
Yeah.
for the state. She wasn't sure there was a sequel in it, and so I wrote this and sent it via Amy to her. And so she comes back asking for a 2-book deal for books 2 and 3 in
Oh,
this series. And at almost the same time is when this Macmillan contract happened. And
yeah.
so I had this book that I was working on editing with Move Books, and then I was working on writing the first draft of this book, for my to fulfill my contract obligation with Macmillan. And and I was teaching full
Yeah.
time.
And now you're
So
teaching again, right?
my my writing routine was that 4 mornings before work, I would have a writing session, and that was my writing routine for years.
Yeah.
And that was kind of my base. And so I sort of, if I could do that, then all the other writing that might happen on the weekend or
Yeah.
after
Was
school would just
bonus, right?
kind of fill in there. Yeah.
So how early did you do that, Paul? I mean, are you getting up at 4 and writing for
Yeah.
2 hours?
Yeah, about 4:30, writing from about 4:45 to 5:45, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then at the same time, I mean, my father was not doing well. And so I was traveling back to Indiana to help with his health care. And I wrote a lot of this book, and it's dedicated to him. a lot of this book I wrote, when I was with him. So
uh,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, that's a nice story too. That um, there's a lot to be said for writers and to tell kids about writing for an hour a day.
yeah,
It can get you somewhere, right? An hour a
yeah,
day can get you somewhere. Plus, if you're doing it well, I think I'm finding from a lot of people that it spurs you to take advantage of the other opportunities because you know you're going to be in it an hour every morning, but the ideas come and you think, oh, I want to write a little bit about that before I forget it, right? So you end up carving out other time that
right.
helps you be more productive with that.
Mhm.
So that's a so you got hostile territory out and you got the follow the river out, and they've been pretty successful in the areas that you've been able to get attention to them. Like you say in Alaska, and I'm assuming in a lot of the middle schools and high schools in Alaska that people know your books in ways that they maybe don't down here in the lower
Right.
48. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
although Scholastic, connecting with Scholastic and stuff like that helps, of course.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the Wildlands was a high school battle of the books book in Alaska.
Yeah,
Sure. And yeah, I would say, in Alaska, and then with this being named the Alaska Reads book a few years ago, there was funding for me to travel. I
yeah.
visited like 12 different communities and gave, book talks and so yeah, I would say you're pretty spot on with that. Like in Alaska, these are fairly, well-known books, and then out from there, yeah, a little less so,
We need to
but
get every alternative school a list
yeah,
of your books,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Say, and
yeah,
Paul will zoom and talk to your class about survival, right? And
yeah,
and how to get
right,
a kayak in the water without tipping it over. I,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
I love the idea that you spent so much time kayaking out in that cold water. How do you survive that? Did you never have an accident? Did you never tip over? And you know,
Yeah. So I mean, as a 20 something year old, I never really thought of myself as a water person in terms of wilderness travel until I moved to Fairbanks in 1990, and I done a lot of backpacking, in a lot
yeah,
of places. But I I made a friend um, who I hit it off with a lot, and he was into kayaking, and we went on my first introduction to sea kayaking was a 9 week 500-mile trip with my friend John Lyle, and I was just hooked on it, and so um we certainly were in a lot of big seas, and we never really made a mistake that was life threatening to us. But there's always, you're always kind of on edge. And so I did that trip, and then the next summer I went out and I did a 3 week solo trip, and then I met my wife to be, and she got into kayaking, and so for years we did 3 and 4 week long sea kayaking trips in Prince William Sound. And so I think you know we try to be safe and make good
yeah,
decisions, and then when you find yourself in a dicey situation, you just try your best to get to somewhere that's protected. and
yeah,
um and I've been fortunate to never have having flipped a kayak. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
um yeah, so
That's really great. Now, how long when you take a 3 week trip?
yeah,
How long each day are you on the water, and how much are you kind of camping and
yeah.
fishing and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's a lot of work to set up a camp and break down a camp in Prince William Sound, because first you've got to get everything above the tide line,
Yeah,
and you're gonna set up for rain because it does rain out there a lot. So you're putting up a couple of big tarps, one for your kitchen, one over your tent. And so like when you're like, so when I was traveling alone, I really had long days on the water because it took so much energy to pack up everything from a camp. And so I would have like 12-hour days, paddling
Wow.
and and taking breaks and stuff. And then with my wife and I, our trips kind of evolved into a little more let's set up camp for a few days, be in a spot, and then we'll move and have kind of a long day, but then we'll have another few days. And so
Yeah.
like her and I, like on a 3-week trip, we paddled a couple 100 miles doing a trip like that, because some of the days would be like 25-mile days
Yeah.
of paddling. But yeah, but it just kind of varies a lot in that way. um
I did enough bicycle touring
oh
um,
yeah, yeah,
in through Utah when I was there as a teacher, and then up into Montana, and I did a
wow,
couple of trips down into Mexico. But
yeah,
that's the thing. It's almost easier in some ways to have a 50 or 60 mile day instead of a 20-mile day, right?
yeah, right, yeah,
Decide where you want to go and where you want to be, and and the terrain will make a difference. Like if you're in Canada going from Banff to Jasper, you
yeah,
have to decide, oh, how much climbing am I going to do today, and
right,
and do I want to stay? And I was not one that stayed um very often more than a day in a place, and about every 3 or 4 days would hit a hotel, but
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
kind of thing if you're on the road. But
yeah.
it's always kind of an interesting dilemma, and I think we don't. I'm wondering if some of that's going to be lost for the next generation of kids. I mean, because you and I are, if not close to the same age, if not certainly within a decade or two, but
Yeah. Oh yeah.
um, we were outside doing some of those things and seeing possibilities. Like the number of guys I see on loaded touring bikes anymore is much, and I live down here in southern Utah near
Right.
Zion's and Bryce. And
Right.
my wife and I just saw somebody out towards Zion fully loaded. And I thought, it's been a while since we've seen
Yeah.
somebody on the road doing that, right?
Right.
And
There's a lot of more like van travel,
yeah,
global
yeah,
gear stuff. I did a big 1,600-mile bike trip in the Southwest. Yeah, and I know what it's like to ride. Yeah, that fully loaded, and you've got like it doesn't look like an elevation game, but it's a steady little climb, and I'm sure you know what that's like.
yeah. It's like,
Yeah,
people say, well, how much do you average? And I think 7, 8 miles an hour, maybe.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Going downhill, you'll make up some of that. But
yeah,
I can remember, and if you're in some place where you've got to cross the Continental Divide,
yeah.
you're going up before
Right.
you get to go down, much. And
Yeah.
that's I've done Yellowstone a couple of times, the southern loop of Yellowstone, and it looks on a map really manageable. And
Sure.
and you can do it, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
still a challenge to do those things. And I think that a lot more kids would be interested in those stories and those things. So now tell us what you're doing now. Are you teaching still, or have you?
Yeah. So, so my teaching career, when I came back into teaching in 2011, I wanted to do something different. And there was a position open at one of the local high schools as the English language learner teacher,
Mhm.
ELL. And it was, the woman was on maternity leave. It was clear she was going to come back to her job. And so, but it was really interesting because I really went from like the worst behaved kids in the school district to the best behaved, because you had these kids from these different countries that were very polite and everything. And I'll just tell you one little story about, just to kind of demonstrate this. So when I worked at the alternative school, we had to do standardized testing. Kids couldn't have cell phones,
Yeah.
and in the alternative school, for some of those kids, if you asked them for their cell phone, they would refuse, they would cuss you out, they would walk out the door. No way were they ever going to do that. And so with the ELL program at the West Valley High School, getting ready to do the standardized tests, 2011, it's still pencil paper. And I'm getting ready to ask them to all like bring their cell phones up, put them on my desk. And I'm like feeling myself getting kind of nervous. I'm like, what's going to happen here? And I was just amazed that they all just walked up and just put them on my desk. And I was just like,
Yeah.
oh, that's how this works, But so that was my introduction back in. But then I really got interested in like, because I wasn't at the time a special education teacher. I was an English teacher who had worked with a lot of special education kids. And
Yeah.
when I was in that high school for a year, I saw what the resource teachers were doing, and I got really interested in that. And so I went in Alaska. They had this program where if you start your graduate program in special education and you're already a teacher, once you have 9 graduate credits, you could get a special education job with a waiver with the agreement you're going to finish it in a
Finish.
reasonable
Yeah.
amount of time, And so that's what I did. And so I became a resource teacher. And I always thought I would teach high school, but my first job as a resource teacher was kindergarten through 3rd grade.
Wow.
And I stuck with that for the next 10 years and loved it. It was like I had all these years of education at the alternative school and before that with outdoor ed. And I kind of felt fresh like a new teacher because I was doing something new. And I realized like, oh yeah, I've been teaching reading and writing for years, but guess what? I need to learn my letter sounds because I don't really know them, I don't, yeah. So I was learning all these new things. And so I did that for 10 years. Um, and it kind of took me through COVID, which was a big challenge.
Yeah.
Teach
Yeah.
learning disabled kids with masks on and everything. And my writing really kind of fell off during COVID. It was just a lot of just I was putting my energy into the teaching, and by the end of the day or before school, I really wasn't interested in using my brain in that way. And so last year I made a change. I took a leave of absence from my resource teacher job with the Fairbanks School District, and I took a half-time position as a special education teacher for a homeschool.
Oh,
And in Alaska, uh, almost every school district has a homeschool program that they run, and often these programs are statewide. And so
yeah.
for the last school year, I worked for Raven Homeschool as a special education teacher. I worked about 100 days a year. Um, and that's what I'm doing this year as well.
Well,
And that has really opened up writing time for me. So it's like 2 or 3 days a week, and then I use the balance of my time for writing. And I was able to complete book 3
of
of
that. Oh,
this
good.
last year. That was my goal. And so my publisher has that manuscript now. And I really, I think it was a really good change for me at this point in my education career. So I'd still have a hand in helping kids and helping parents who are really the teachers in homeschool. So it's a lot of advising parents. So yeah, so that's working out well.
So
Yeah.
so your writing process now on those days, are you a full day writer, or you say 3 hours in the chair and I'm good? Or what does that look like for you?
Yeah. So it varies a little bit because I do like to get outside and exercise.
Yeah.
I'm a runner too, a long distance runner, so I do a bit of that. And so when I was working on book 3 of this trilogy last year, I was pretty focused. And so those other days of the week were largely probably 5 hours would be plenty of writing time,
Yeah.
in a day. And so now, I completed that project in I guess I sent it off to my editor in May. Okay. And so it's really just been June, July, August, September, October. And now I have this other project that I'm working on. I was last year I was the recipient of the Alaska Literary Award, which is
Oh,
a
great, great.
biggest award in Alaska for, your contributions to literature. And part of the award, is like part of the application process is having, yeah, like how is this award going to further your development as a writer,
Yeah.
So and so I've been thinking about this quite a bit because I have aspirations to write more young adult novels, more middle grade novels. I have an adult novel I've started. And then when I really looked at like my whole like education career, and I looked at like working with these kindergarten through third grade struggling readers the last 10 years. So my plan was is, I should say, not was, is to write a chapter book that will engage reluctant and struggling readers. And so to kind of like to try to write something that's gonna pick up those readers a little earlier than
Then
follow the
following
river.
readers.
Right. And so
Yeah.
so I'm working on a chapter book right now. And
Oh,
so
very,
and
very good.
that's been a little you know I had a little less writing time, I would say, in the summer because I spent a lot more time outside.
Yeah.
And so I'm getting back into that routine now, and I've got about 6 chapters of this story written.
Oh,
It's about going to be probably about a 10 to 13,000 word story instead of a 60
yeah.
to 90,000 word story. So that's what I'm working on right now. Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
that's great. I love that you're doing that, and that you're attentive to the audiences, right? They're they're out there, and we, for as much as people say, I think publishing was really hit hard by COVID.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hands-on book stuff was really difficult, and I
Mhm.
think kids are still trying to navigate whether or not we're going to read digitally, or whether we're going to read hands-on, or whether it's going to be a combination, because they're getting to the point where so much is available digitally that I'm
Right.
not sure teachers know what to do with it, right? They don't know
Right.
how to think about that. How do we have a class read? Do we have tablets? Do we have phones? And I think we're in a really
Yeah.
interesting space. And for you to pay attention to those kids that struggle in the first place,
Yeah.
we can't figure out with regular kids, let alone kids that might be struggling, right? So
Right.
we're in a real, I think, sea change of what reading's going to look like for kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Okay.
get something done.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
When you get something, I put that in parentheses all the time because things for a writer are
Yeah.
never quite done, because
Right.
eventually it's going to go to an editor, is going to have other things. But
Yeah.
what kind of reading revision? How do you tackle it before you give it to an editor, and then after you give it to an editor?
Yeah.
What's that
Yeah.
structure look like for you?
So, 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 and every one of these 4 books was all written a little bit differently, but what I discovered after I wrote this book, a draft of this book and revised it, I discovered the 3-act structure, which is kind of a screenwriting structure of writing. And so like what I did with this book, once I got connected with that 3-act structure, like I sort of like I revised this book to fit it into a 3-act structure. And so I try to, like, my writing process in general for all of these books is got this idea, very solid idea that's kind of grabbed me around the throat, won't let go, write the first 15, 20 pages of the book, then stop and kind of loosely outline it in a 3-act structure, not to really define things, but just have this kind of path and know what those acts are gonna be. And so when I revise, I take a close look at that and see how I'm doing with that. And the other thing I do, and and every writer is different, but
Sure.
for me, my first drafts are very plot heavy. And for me, a lot of the character development happens in the revision where other writers might be a little more, I've got this character, it's gonna,
Okay.
because the character is gonna drive the plot. And but that's just kind of how I feel like I get a lot of momentum with the plot of my story, because once you have a finished draft, then you have got something to work with, and that is just gold right there, to
Yeah.
actually be sitting there with a completed first draft, and then you're gonna mold it, shape it, however you want. Just like when this book, the original Tom in this book was a really angry, down on his luck, troubled kid. And boy, by the time this book went through all these revisions, I mean, he's a very different character, in this book.
You saw.
Passionate, loving, everything. So yeah, it's just but I do a lot of the character development in those successive drafts. And then I eventually I hand it over to my wife to give it a read. And she gives me, because she was an English professor. Well, she was developmental English, so she
Yeah.
taught college kids who weren't quite ready for college. That was
Yeah.
her professor of developmental education. But she also has an MFA in creative writing and is a very astute reader. I read a lot, but she reads about 4 times as much as me, and so she's my first reader. And yeah, so that's kind of the process before the editor.
Yeah.
And then with the editor, it kind of depends on what kind of editor you have. Because I had 2 editors over the years, and like for these books with Eileen Robinson, who is this amazing, talented person who started Move Books, who for kids who were reluctant readers. I mean, that was her whole push, which has recently been bought by Charlesbridge. So now it's an imprint at Charlesbridge.
Okay.
It's called Charlesbridge Moves. But Eileen would send me things in pieces, like, oh, here's chapter 2, my ideas. Here's chapter 7. And so it was like I had to really be, just like, because I like to work with a whole thing. And
You're right.
but together we have put out some really great books, and I'm totally excited to work with her on book 3 of this that
Yeah.
I sent her, because we know how to work together. Okay.
Yeah.
And then like my editor at Macmillan, John Morgan, he was very much a track changes guy. And
Yeah.
and so like we had a whole, like in this original Wildlands book, there was one of those 4 characters originally had a drinking problem. And John told me, he said, it's your story. You can keep that subplot in there. I think it takes away from the story. It's a distraction. And so he sent me a revision, and on like page 67, it was like, and here starts the whiskey subplot. And like everywhere it came up, he would note it.
Uh-huh.
I went back through and wove this other plot line into where that was. And it was a very much kind of this strategic like strike, on that subplot. Get out. So yeah, and I can work with both of those ends of the spectrum successfully. Yeah, but it really depends on the editor, I would say, a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like you're hitting your stride, and I look forward to doing this. Are your publishers talking about sending you to Allen or any of those kinds of things in the future with the third book? Or
Well, I mean, that third book is probably a year and a half out
yeah,
for coming out. So we haven't really talked about that yet. But I would love, to go back to Allen. That was kind of a dream come true to sit up there on that
yeah, yeah.
stage. Yeah.
So
For
yeah, well, keep
years.
me posted on when these things show up, because
I'll
I
do
think as
that.
that book gets ready,
Yeah.
if it's not Blasting Game or somebody, I'll try to find somebody who's in that vein who'd like to
Yeah.
look at all 3 and write a post for us. So that'd be fantastic.
Yeah. Hey, can I share with you one letter
Sure.
I got from a kid?
Oh, absolutely.
This was from out of state. And this is like, I've gotten a few letters over the years, but this is like kind of a cut above. And it sort of hits all the points about like why I write for the kids I write for. Dear Paul, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the couple paragraphs. When I was a kid in elementary school, my teachers had to force me to read. I have ADHD and I couldn't sit still long enough to focus on one thing and actually understand it. My ADHD caused me to fail most of my classes in school until 8th grade when I finally got an IEP for school and started taking medication for my ADHD.
Mm.
I went through almost all of my educational career thinking I was just stupid because everyone else my age just understood what the teachers were talking about, while I was in the corner not even being able to solve simple equations or even finish a book because it would take me hours to just read a couple of pages. When I was 11 or 12, my parents took my older sister to the bookstore and brought me along with them despite my protests. My sister got the book she was looking for and also found a book she thought I would like, which happened to be your book, The Wildlands. Because we were going on a trip and we wouldn't have cell reception for hours, my parents bought it for me to read on the road, even though I had no intention to read it. About halfway through the road trip, I remember being bored enough to give it a go and try reading for once. I ended up finishing your book that same day. That was the first time I ever actually finished a book that wasn't 10 pages long and meant for children. I loved your book so much, I bought all your other books. I recommend you to all my friends. I started reading more books by other authors. I still had my trouble with my classes, and I still had room to improve my reading skills, but I started reading every day. Even now, The Wildlands has become my comfort read, and I reread it every so often. I'm almost 17 now, and I have a bookshelf in my room full of books. I read 1 or 2 books a week. English has become my favorite class in school. I joined a club in high school, which got some of my essays published, and now I'm technically an author. I'm even planning on going to college to be an English teacher. So,
Wow.
that just hits it all for me.
Well, and that's why you do that work, right? I think
Yeah,
and there you're channeling Terry Lassane and
yeah,
Donald and Miller, the right book
yeah,
for the right kid. Just
right.
keep throwing them books, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
one will stick, or they'll find the
yeah,
one that sticks. Well,
yeah,
Paul, it's been great to talk with you,
yeah,
and I hope to run into you
yeah,
again sometime
yeah,
and do this. And let's keep in touch as this
yeah.
goes forward. I'm really excited for you.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you.